The story begins in a room where time hangs like cigarette smoke, where memory flickers against the walls, the way old film reels skip through worn projectors. In that dim half-light, Gene Tierney appears, quiet, composed, almost too delicate to belong to the rough machinery of Hollywood. The camera of our imagination lingers on the curve of her cheekbone, the calm lake surface of her gaze, the soft tremor beneath her beauty that only the patient eye can detect. She moves like a whisper through the fog of a bygone era, and yet her presence commands the room, as if some unspoken sorrow clings to her footsteps. She arrived in Hollywood in the early 1940s, but even then, something in her face carried the echo of an older grief, as though the world had carved a faint crack into her spirit long before fame ever laid a hand on her. Beneath the glow of studio lamps, her skin looked almost translucent, as if light could slip through her. The directors saw it at once. A beauty too fragile for this world. A face that promised mystery, tragedy, longing. But what they did not see, or refused to see, was the quiet dread pooling behind her eyes. Archival footage, grainy, unsteady, shows reporters leaning toward her, microphones pointed, like interrogations dressed as adoration. Her smile, polite but weary, passes across the screen like a thin veil. The press would later call her ethereal, untouchable, a living portrait. Yet inside her chest beat a heart that felt the world too deeply. Those who loved her privately whispered that Gene carried emotions like bruises. She hid them, protected them, but felt them all the same. The studios, however, appreciated only the surface, the symmetry, the immaculate stillness. Hollywood was a strange cathedral then, its saints crowned with neon and its sinners cloaked in tailored suits. Smoke curled through its corridors, and deals were struck in shadows thick enough to stain a conscience. For a young woman like Jean, purity of spirit was a dangerous thing. The men who ran the town treated actresses as if they were porcelain, beautiful, valuable, replaceable. Every smile she gave them served as currency. Every role she accepted was another step deeper into the labyrinth of obligation and expectation. But Jean did not yet understand the price. She believed in art, in stories, in the intoxicating promise of creation. She thought that beauty could be a blessing, not a burden. She thought that talent could be a shield, not a spotlight that burned. Her voice in early recordings carries that innocence, gentle, steady, full of hope. She spoke about wanting to move audiences, wanting to bring characters to life, wanting, above all, to make something meaningful. Yet while she dreamed of shaping her destiny, the studios crafted a different design, one built from contracts, publicity, and the cruel arithmetic of fame. In these early years, the war cast its own shadows across the world. 1941, 1942, 1943. America was sending its men overseas, while Hollywood tried to stitch morale back together with fantasy. Jean starred in films that shimmered with escapism, her beauty a balm for a nation wounded by conflict. But behind the scenes, wartime pressures tightened like invisible wires around her life. She attended bond rallies, hospital visits, charity events, each one chipping away a little more of her privacy. Crowds pressed close. Fans reached for her. The war blurred the line between public service and public sacrifice, and Jean, ever dutiful, gave more of herself than anyone realized. Somewhere in these years, the first fracture formed. It was not dramatic, not a collapse, not a scream, not a headline. It was a quiet moment. Just a breath, really, where she felt something inside her shift. She later described it as a faint trembling in the mind, a kind of internal draft that made the soul shiver. Whether it came from fatigue, fear, or the weight of expectation, she could not say, but it lingered. The footage grows dimmer, the music slows, The narrator's voice, my voice, lowers with the gravity of what is to come. For Gene Tierney was not merely a star. She was a woman walking toward a tragedy she could not yet name. The pressures of the industry were tightening around her like a noose, stitched from whispers. She was adored, yes, but adoration is its own kind of prison. And behind every camera lens, behind every handshake, behind every contract, there existed something darker, a hunger that did not care about the fragility of a human heart. Near the end of 1943, a studio photographer captured her in a rare moment of stillness. Jean looking out a window, her reflection merging with the smudged glass, her gaze distant as though she already sensed the shadows gathering. The image is haunting now, not for what it shows, but for what it predicts. Because beauty, when placed in the wrong hands, can become a curse. And Gene Tierney was about to learn just how poisonous the admiration of strangers could be. The lights fade on part one, with a question suspended in the dark, like a whisper caught between breaths. How long can a delicate soul survive when the world refuses to see the cracks forming beneath its own creation? The war years pressed forward with the relentless rhythm of distant artillery, and Hollywood adjusted its heartbeat to match. Men shipped out, women waited. Every street carried an air of longing. Every radio crackled with uncertainty, and every movie theater became a sanctuary where Americans could briefly forget the world's unraveling. Inside that fragile refuge, Gene Tierney's face glowed like a promise. Yet promises made under flickering lights are often the first to fracture. Studios knew the value of her radiance. They polished it, amplified it, weaponized it. Posters bore her image in exaggerated hues, her beauty turned into a beacon bright enough to pierce the gloom of wartime America. She became a symbol, an emblem of serenity in an era defined by chaos. But symbols, once created, ceased to belong to themselves. Jean felt this shift with a quiet dread, like watching her own reflection drift further away each time she reached for it. Archival memos dated 1944 show studio executives discussing her future as if mapping out a product line. Terms like marketability, public demand, and emotional resonance orbit her name with clinical detachment. They admired her allure, but misunderstood its source. They believed it lay in the perfection of her features, the silence of her gestures, the elegance she wore like a second skin. What they didn't grasp was that Jean's magnetism came not from flawlessness, but from vulnerability, the subtle ache that seemed to tremble behind every glance. That vulnerability, however, was something the world would soon exploit without mercy. It was during this period that she starred in Laura, 1944, a film that would immortalize her in the pantheon of noir icons. The movie's opening shot, Jean framed in shadow, her portrait looming like a ghost, became a touchstone for the era. Audiences were captivated by the paradox she embodied, a woman both present and unreachable, luminous yet haunted. Hollywood celebrated the performance, unaware that the line between character and actress was thinning. Jean played a phantom loved by a detective, a beauty shaped by others' desires, and perhaps for the first time, she recognized herself in the script's tragic architecture. Public adoration surged, crowds mobbed her appearances. Soldiers wrote to her from trenches, foxholes, ships tossed across hostile seas. Some said her films kept them alive, kept them dreaming. Others offered devotion in words too fervent to ignore. The country was clinging to her image as if it were a lifeline. And in that desperate embrace, Jean found herself suffocating. Fame no longer felt like a spotlight. It felt like a fever, one that blurred the edges of identity, until she could no longer distinguish her true self from the projection. During a USO event in Washington, witnesses recalled seeing her smile with mechanical grace. Her lips curved, but her eyes glazed with exhaustion. It was a smile, stretched too thin, a gesture rehearsed until it no longer belonged to joy. Behind her, banners fluttered, brass bands played, and the cameras flashed like lightning probing a silent storm. Nobody noticed how she trembled when the applause grew too loud. Nobody questioned why her hands turned cold the moment she stepped off stage. Fame was still young for her then, still seductive, still wrapped in ribbons of validation. But beneath it all was the first trace of poison seeping into the bloodstream of her soul. The tragedy that would later define her life was still waiting in the wings, quiet as a breath drawn before breaking. Yet signs of its approach appeared in subtle ways. Gene began losing sleep, her mind restless, her nerves taut like wires pulled to the verge of snapping. She described waking with a heaviness she could not name, as though the night itself had pressed its wake into her chest. During filming sessions, she drifted between takes, her eyes following something only she could sense, a shadow too intimate to be external. But the studios didn't slow. They never did. Hollywood in the 1940s was a ravenous machine, and Gene was one of its most precious offerings. She traveled constantly. Los Angeles to New York to Washington, Washington to bases scattered across the country. Train windows caught her reflection in passing flashes. Two eyes swimming in fatigue, lips pursed as if holding back a secret fear she herself could not articulate. By late 1944, rumors circulated quietly around makeup rooms and studio hallways. Some said she was becoming distant. Others whispered she was too emotional, too fragile. A few questioned whether she had the strength for such persistent adoration. Fame, in their view, was a test of endurance. But Gene was not built for endurance. She was built for grace, nuance, tenderness. Life demanded more brutal things. And then, as the winter deepened, the event occurred that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A moment so slight, so ordinary, so deceptively harmless that she didn't realize it would splinter her destiny. It would not reveal itself until later, when the pieces of her life began to fracture, when doctors and headlines and whispered recollections finally linked together a chain of sorrow that started with a single interaction. In photographs from that season, she still appears radiant, but if you look closely, the light no longer seems to touch her the same way. Her beauty has taken on the faint shimmer of a mirror beginning to crack, reflecting something both lovely and doomed. The part ends with a question that lingers like a tremor beneath the frame. What unseen force had already begun tightening its grip on Gene Tierney, preparing to rewrite her life with the cold ink of tragedy? It happened on a night, wrapped in wartime gloom, the kind of evening where the sky hung low over America like a heavy curtain of doubt. In early 1945, Gene Tierney attended a celebrity canteen event meant to lift the spirits of soldiers home on leave. The hall glowed with soft yellow bulbs, the air thick with cigarette haze, laughter, and the brittle optimism of men who had looked death in the eye. Gene moved through the room with the practiced elegance of a hostess, offering smiles that felt more like duty than delight, each gesture polished to conceal the fatigue gathering beneath her ribs. Somewhere in that crowd stood a woman who should not have been there. Feverish, determined, pale with the remnants of illness she refused to acknowledge. She approached Gene with the trembling eagerness of someone desperate for a moment's connection. Witnesses would later recall nothing unusual. The brief clasp of hands, the shy greeting, the fan's breathless confession that she had escaped from quarantine to meet her idol. At the time, the words slid past Gene like vapor, lost in the noise of applause and radio static. Only much later would their meaning return with the crushing severity of fate. For that woman had contracted rubella, and Gene, suffused in the warmth of her selfless smile, unaware of the invisible danger suspended in the air between them, carried that encounter home. Rubella was a quiet invader, its early symptoms subtle enough to mask themselves beneath exhaustion. By the time she realized something was wrong, the illness had already passed through her bloodstream like an uninvited whisper. And Jean was pregnant. Newspaper clippings from the spring of 1945 glow with optimism. Jean's rising fame, her marriage to Oleg Cassini, the promise of a new era after the war. They speak of premieres, gowns, headlines, the triumphant release of Leave Her to Heaven. None of them mention what she endured privately, the dread that gnawed at her when she learned the risks rubella posed to unborn children, the way her doctor's words sank into her bones like cold iron. Congenital defects, heart abnormalities, hearing loss, mental disability. The list unfolded like a prophecy she could not outrun. Hollywood, with its lacquered sets and painted backdrops, offered no place for a mother's terror. Studio executives urged calm, whispering reassurances that glossed over the seriousness of her condition. Their eyes fixed on schedules and contracts, rather than on the tremor in Jean's voice. Her beauty had always been their priority. Her suffering was an inconvenient subplot. She attended fittings and read scripts with a numb determination, masking the dread that pulsed through her with every passing month. When her daughter, Daria, the photograph released to the press, showed joy, celebration, triumph. But behind closed doors, a different truth awaited. Daria was profoundly disabled. She was deaf, partially blind, and severely impacted by mental developmental delays. For Jean, the news arrived not as a single blow, but as a slow collapse, each detail tearing through her heart with measured cruelty. The guilt swallowed her. She blamed herself for the illness, for the moment of contact, for every fear she could not control. It was irrational, tragic, and utterly human. Noir is built on shadows, but the shadow that fell over Jean was not cinematic. It was real, suffocating, merciless. She visited her daughter in specialized institutions that promised care but felt colder than any film set. She described walking through sterile hallways where silence echoed like a reprimand, nurses offering soft, sympathetic smiles that only deepened the ache. She cradled Daria's small, fragile form, felt the uneven rhythm of her breathing, and understood that her child's life would be shaped by suffering she could neither mend nor mitigate. She never spoke of the fan again, at least not then. The studios discouraged such talk. Wartime heroism made for better copy than wartime tragedy. And Jean, ever conscious of her public role, folded her pain into the creases of her composure. But something inside her fractured irreparably. The illness, the birth, the guilt, it all became the silent scream that echoed behind her immaculate façade. Her next films bear a subtle, haunting tension, as though the camera captured not just a performance, but an undercurrent of grief she could not restrain. In Leave Her to Heaven, where she plays a woman tormented by jealousy and desperation, audiences saw brilliance. What they did not see was the quiet despair that allowed her to inhabit that role so convincingly. Critics praised her for achieving a kind of emotional perfection. They did not understand the cost. Behind the glow of 1940s Hollywood lies an unspoken truth. The brightest stars cast the darkest shadows. And Gene Tierney, once the embodiment of ethereal beauty, was sinking deeper into the twilight between who she was and what the world demanded of her. The event that triggered her unraveling had passed so quietly, so innocently, that no one, Not even she understood the magnitude of its consequences until it was far too late. As part 3 dims to black, the question floats like a ghost across the frame. What happens to a soul when sorrow becomes its constant companion, and the world insists she hide the wounds that define her? In the mid-1940s, Gene Tierney walked through the gilded corridors of stardom like a woman drifting through a waking dream, present in the motions, absent in the marrow. Hollywood kept her image pristine, the gowns, the coiffed hair, the interviews where she floated through scripted answers, as though reciting lines she no longer believed. But beneath that exquisitely painted surface, her spirit was eroding grain by grain, like chalk dissolving beneath a cold rain. She carried the weight of Daria's condition alone, held tight against her ribs where no camera could pry. Silence became her only refuge, yet silence also became her tormentor. In hotel rooms and dressing rooms, she would stare at the mirror, at that legendary face, perfect as porcelain, and wonder how something so exquisitely composed could feel so irreparably broken inside. She had been crafted by the studios into a symbol of composure. But symbols cannot tremble. Symbols cannot cry. And so, she learned to suffer invisibly. After Leave Her to Heaven, 1945, earned her an Academy Award nomination, Gene's career should have soared unimpeded. But success had become a hollow thing, an echo inside her chest. The applause at premieres rattled like bones. Parties blurred into indistinct smears of cigarette smoke and hollow laughter. She felt the world slipping out of focus, each joyous moment tinged with the faint bitterness of unreality. Fame had become a surreal film projected around her, one she starred in but could no longer feel connected to. Friends noticed changes, subtle at first, then undeniable. She grew quieter, withdrawn. Her once luminous gaze dimmed, as though a veil had fallen over her inner light. When asked about motherhood, she would smile with mechanical grace, offering vague phrases to deflect further curiosity. But late at night, after the lights dimmed and the crowds dissolved, her grief tightened around her like a noose made of memory. Gene had always been introspective, but introspection began to turn inward like a blade. She replayed the moment of the fans' embrace with obsessive clarity. The feverish breath, the trembling excitement, the admission of quarantine escaped. The scene returned to her in dreams, distorted by darkness, the fan's face blurred into a mask of guilt and inevitability. Gene would wake drenched in sweat, her heartbeat frantic, her breath sharp as broken glass. The doctors called it anxiety. She knew it was something deeper, something corrosive. Oleg Cassini, her husband, tried to steady her, but he too was swept into the turbulence of their glamorous world. Parties, premieres, obligations. He floated through them with a designer's poise, unaware that his wife's internal architecture was beginning to crumble. Marriage under Hollywood spotlight was rarely a shelter. It was more often another stage where expectations performed a relentless choreography of pressure and disappointment. Their arguments, rare but sharp, left her feeling more isolated than ever. By 1946, Gene's emotional fractures began widening. On set, she forgot lines she once absorbed effortlessly. She grew sensitive to noise, to changes in lighting, to the energy of those around her. Crew members whispered. Directors grew wary, and yet, when the camera rolled, something miraculous happened. The act of becoming someone else steadied her. If only for a moment, she could slip into characters, the way one might slip into a warm coat on a cold night, seeking protection in borrowed identities. But even that sanctuary began to fail her. During the filming of Dragon Wick, 1946, colleagues observed the first unmistakable signs of a deeper unraveling. Between takes, she wandered the set with a dazed expression, running her fingers along props as if they were foreign objects. She spoke less. She held herself as though she feared her body might fracture under the strain of simply existing. When she did smile, the expression seemed delayed, detached, as though her mind were drifting someplace just beyond the reach of the present moment. Reporters, oblivious to the storm inside her, continued crafting stories about her poise, her elegance, her mystical allure. Fame thrived on illusions, after all, and Gene's illusion was one Hollywood depended upon. But the gap between illusion and truth was widening, and she felt herself slipping through it like a woman falling between two realities. In 1947, while touring for public appearances, Gene described a strange sensation. The world felt distant, muffled, as though wrapped in layers of cotton. She heard voices as echoes, saw faces as silhouettes, drained of warmth. Depression had settled into her bones, a cold companion that refused to loosen its grip. At a charity event in New York, a journalist later recalled watching her gaze drift away mid-conversation, her eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. It was not boredom. It was the look of someone holding back a tidal wave with trembling hands. Jean's family grew concerned. Her mother, Claire, urged her to rest, to step away from the industry's demands. But rest was a luxury Hollywood rarely allowed. Contracts were binding, schedules were unyielding, and Gene, still clinging to the remnants of her sense of duty, pushed herself forward, even as her inner foundation crumbled. In moments of private reflection, she questioned whether she was being punished, whether fate had singled her out for suffering because she had been too blessed, too admired, too adored. Guilt became her constant companion, whispering that she deserved the weight pressing down on her, that her daughter's condition was her responsibility, that her unraveling was merely the logical continuation of the tragedy she had failed to prevent. As Part 4 draws its final breath, one question hangs in the dim, fog-shrouded air. What happens when the roles she played become steadier than the woman she truly was? And what will she lose as the curtain draws tighter around her fragile mind? By the late 1940s, Gene Tierney stood at the edge of a precipice she could neither name nor turn away from. Hollywood had once framed her as a dream made flesh, a woman sculpted from silver light and quiet longing. But dreams, when stretched thin enough, begin to tremble, and Gene was trembling now, subtly at first, then visibly, as though her very soul had begun to slip out of alignment. Her marriage to Oleg Cassini strained under the weight of her sorrow. Love, no matter how genuine, cannot always reach the dark corners where despair burrows. Arguments rose from misunderstandings, from fatigue, from the unspoken dread that coiled between them. Some nights, she would retreat from the world entirely, roaming the house like a ghost in silk, her bare feet brushing cold floors as she tried to outrun the turbulence in her mind. Other nights, she sat alone near the window, smoking in silence, watching the city lights blur into indistinct halos. New York, once a place of glamour and possibility, now looked to her like a reflection of her own fractured psyche, a city of dazzling surfaces and hidden wounds. She continued to work, though each film carved more from her than it gave in return. In The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, 1947, her quiet grief lent her performance a mournful authenticity that critics praised. Yet what they called delicate melancholy was in truth a reflection of her unraveling. Acting had once been a refuge. Now it became a mirror she could not escape. Each role peeled back another layer of her emotional defenses, leaving her exposed to the very shadows she wished so desperately to forget. By 1948, Gene's depression had grown into something more insidious. She struggled to eat. She struggled to sleep. She moved through days as though submerged underwater, her mind slow, her gestures heavy. A studio physician prescribed rest, but rest only intensified her thoughts. Without distraction, her guilt over Daria seeped into every corner of her consciousness. She visited her daughter more frequently then, walking through the stark hallways of the institution, where the walls hummed with fluorescent light and sorrow. Nurses greeted her kindly, but their sympathy burned her like an accusation. She felt she had failed in the most fundamental role a woman could occupy, that of protector. In those visits, Gene pressed small toys in Kadaria's unresponsive hands, humming lullabies the child could not hear. When Daria gazed past her, as if watching something invisible dance in the air, Gene's heart fractured anew. Leaving the facility always felt like abandoning a part of herself. She would return to her car with trembling hands, begging her breath to steady, forcing a smile for the driver who opened the door. The facade was exhausting, the truth unbearable. Her family intervened gently at first, then more firmly. Claire Tierney, her mother, urged her to consider treatment for what physicians had begun calling severe emotional exhaustion. Her father, Howard, worried but pragmatic, encouraged her to retreat from Hollywood entirely, to seek solace away from the spotlight's relentless demand. But Gene still clung to the belief that she could hold herself together with sheer willpower. She was Gene Tierney, America's ethereal beauty. She had navigated fame, tragedy, heartbreak. Surely she could navigate this. She could not. In 1949, the unraveling became undeniable. During a performance in The Pleasure of His Company, she froze on stage, unable to retrieve a single line. The audience murmured, mistaking her wide-eyed silence for dramatic pause. Backstage, she collapsed into tears, her body shaking with a force that frightened even the hardened stagehands. Whispered conversations followed her through the dressing rooms. Words like breakdown, instability, fragile. Hollywood was not kind to fragile women. They became liabilities. Gene stepped away from acting soon after. But the world did not quiet for her. Instead, her thoughts grew louder, sharper, like shards of glass turning in her mind. She experienced waves of panic that left her breathless and trembling. She wandered rooms without purpose, forgetting why she had entered them. At times, her memory flickered like a failing light. At others, she felt swallowed by a grief so vast it seemed to eclipse her very identity. Her family sought psychiatric help, and Gene, exhausted and frightened by her own mind, agreed. She entered the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, a place known for its quiet gardens and long contemplative hallways. There, the scent of antiseptic mingled with the faint aroma of autumn leaves. Nurses moved with gentle efficiency. Doctors spoke in calm tones, asking questions that felt like lanterns probing the dark. For the first time, Gene admitted the thoughts she had been hiding, the crushing guilt, the intrusive fears, the sense that her soul no longer fit inside her body. She spoke of dreams where Daria reached for her across an empty void she could never cross. She confessed how fame felt like a mask that had fused to her skin. Doctors nodded, listening without judgment, piecing together the complex architecture of a mind collapsing under years of unspoken torment. But the treatments then were harsh by modern standards. Electroconvulsive therapy, administered without today's nuance, left her disoriented and frightened. Her memories blurred. The world took on a hazy, surreal quality. She felt like a visitor in her own life, walking through corridors that echoed with unfamiliar footsteps. Still, she stayed, because she feared what she might become if she left. And so Part 5 closes within those silent, sterile rooms where Gene lay awake under dim hospital lights, wondering whether healing was possible or whether the shadows had already claimed too much of her. A final question drifts through the quiet. How does a woman rebuild herself when even her memories have begun to slip through her trembling hands? Winter seeped through the walls of the Menninger Clinic, settling into its long hallways like a patient visitor. Outside, the Kansas fields lay bare beneath pale skies, wind brushing through them with a lonely whistle that seemed to echo Gene Tierney's internal landscape. Inside, she moved through the days with a tentative fragility, each hour blending into the next, as though time itself had lost interest in distinguishing one moment from another. Her reflections had become strangers. In the mornings, she stood before the small bathroom mirror, lifting her gaze only to flinch at what stared back. The face the public adored, flawless, serene, beloved, had transformed into something she barely recognized. Not in its beauty, but in its emptiness. Her eyes looked clouded, as if a veil of sorrow had drawn across them. Her features, once animated by gentle curiosity, now drooped with exhaustion. The woman in the mirror wasn't Gene Tierney, Hollywood's delicate enchantress. She was someone else. Someone worn the mid-1950s found Gene Tierney drifting through her own life, like a figure blurred on a damaged reel of film. The world had not stopped turning, but she had lost her place within its rhythm. Every attempt to re-enter Hollywood's orbit left her more disoriented, more aware of how the industry's glittering architecture had been built without room for fragile souls. Fame had become a reflection in a cracked mirror, still recognizable, still shimmering, but distorted in ways she could no longer bear to examine. She lived in intervals then, moments of clarity followed by long stretches of fog. Electroshock therapy had carved holes into the map of her memory, erasing entire roads she once traveled with ease. Some were small, others devastating. She forgot details of films she had starred in, names of acquaintances, lines of poetry she once recited effortlessly. Even pieces of her daughter's past seemed to slip away, like photographs left too long in the sun. The erasure scared her, but she was too exhausted to resist. She had fought her mind for years, and her mind had proved the stronger adversary. Still, there were glimmers, brief, flickering sparks that suggested something within her refused to surrender entirely. She found comfort in simple things: quiet mornings, the feel of sunlight on her hands, the weight of a book, even if she could not always follow its story. She wrote letters she rarely sent, walked pathways she rarely finished, spoke softly to strangers who passed her with polite, puzzled smiles. Her beauty, though worn by sorrow, remained unmistakable. Yet now it carried an older, gentler melancholy, as though her face itself understood what it meant to endure. In 1957, she met W. Howard Lee, a Texas oil man whose presence arrived not with fanfare, but with a quiet steadiness that Gene had long forgotten could exist. He did not see her as an illusion, nor as a fragile artifact from Hollywood's golden age. He saw a woman who had been bruised by life, who moved through the world with caution because the world had taught her to. He listened without judgment. He spoke without pretense. He offered her something she had not been granted in decades: the permission to simply be. Their courtship unfolded slowly, gently, like a dawn hesitant to break after a long night. Gene was wary at first. Trust, after all, had become a currency she could scarcely afford. She flinched at happiness, as one might flinch at sudden light after years spent underground. But Howard was patient, understanding that love was not a cure, but a companionship, a warm hand offered to someone walking through cold corridors. Her time with him marked a subtle shift in her trajectory. She spent less time in the echoing halls of psychiatric institutions and more time in the quiet landscapes of Texas, where wide skies and open fields offered a different kind of healing. The horizon stretched endlessly, unbroken, and in that expansiveness, she felt something inside her begin to thaw. She laughed occasionally, though softly, as if testing whether her voice still remembered joy. And sometimes, in rare and precious instances, she forgot to feel afraid. Yet the shadows did not vanish. Mental illness is not a story of vanquishing, but of living alongside the lingering darkness. There were nights when her thoughts curled inward, pulling her back toward the abyss. There were days when memories failed her, slipping through her grasp like dust. But she was no longer fighting alone. Howard became her anchor, grounding her when the vertigo of her mind threatened to pull her under. In 1960, they married. A quiet ceremony, discreet. Far from Hollywood's prying eyes, she wore a calmness that had eluded her for years. Not a cure, not a transformation, but a fragile piece stitched together from hard-won acceptance. Gene was no longer the ethereal star who floated through shadowed sets and glamorous premieres. She was a woman, rebuilding herself from the remnants of what life had taken. Her later years unfolded in gentle rhythms. She wrote an autobiography, Self-Portrait, 1979, where she confronted her past with a clarity she had not possessed in her youth. She spoke openly of her illness, of Daria, of the pressures that fame inflicted with razor-like subtlety. Her honesty was radical for its time, a stark contrast to the glossy facades Hollywood once demanded. She was no longer hiding. She was no longer shaping herself to fit anyone's narrative but her own. When Gene visited Daria in adulthood, she did so with a softer heart. The guilt remained. It would always remain, but it no longer consumed her entirely. Their time together, though limited by circumstance, held a quiet tenderness. Gene kissed her daughter's hands, held her face gently, whispered words the child could not hear, but perhaps could feel. In those moments, the years of anguish settled into something that resembled acceptance. By the 1980s, Gene's public appearances were rare. She lived in near seclusion with Howard, embracing a serenity that had once seemed impossible. She was older now, her beauty transformed into a landscape marked by experience. The world remembered her as the luminous star of Laura and Leave Her to Heaven. But Gene herself had learned to remember the woman behind the image, the one who endured tragedy, shattered under pressure, and found, against all odds, a narrow path back to herself. Her life was not a tale of triumph over darkness, but of coexistence with it. A noir heroine not undone, but tempered, burned, but still warm. And as this final chapter fades into shadow, one last question lingers, soft, solemn, suspended like smoke in a dim-lit room. In the end, was Gene Tierney saved by love, or did she simply learn how to live with the ghosts that had been with her all along?